We will kick off. Now the Minister's joined us as well. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Bright Blue's panel event on Going Private, Reforming the UK's Rental Market. My name is Alexandra Jezeph. I'm on the board of Bright Blue, which is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. We have 7 key themes to our research, which cover the themes of bountiful economy, clean environment, good lives, rewarding work, empowering government, just institutions, and connected communities. In hosting this event, we're very pleased to be partnering with the NRLA, which is the National Residential Landlords Association. And if you are, it is a bit of a mouthful, if you are on Twitter, please do use hashtag BrightBlue, hashtag CPC23, and the Twitter handles are @WeAreBrightBlue and @NRL Association. There are around 11.6 million people living in the private rental sector in England, and the number of households living in private rented accommodation has doubled over the past 20 years. For landlords, the recent interest rate hikes coupled with the toughening tax environment mean the economics of renting are such that many are selling up. For renters, on the other hand, this reduction in supply, amongst other factors, has driven rent as a share of income to its highest level in over a decade. Polling by Bright Blue released today found that the top 2 issues facing young people in Britain are housing and also inflation and the cost of living. Rent now takes up around 28% of average earnings across the country, and that rises to 40% if you're in London. So the Rental Reform Bill, which was introduced to Parliament earlier this year in May, aims to rebalance the rights of and responsibilities of both renters and landlords. It proposes the abolition of Section 21 no-fault evictions, amongst other things, and it advocates strengthening Section 8, which empowers landlords to retake possession of their properties in certain circumstances, including in the event of a breach of the lease. But does this give both landlord and tenant the certainty they need, and how do we get that balance right so that both parties get a fair deal? So this afternoon's debate will examine the state of the rental market and where change is most urgently needed, and we have asked our panellists to consider quite a long list of questions, but I'll pick just a handful. So what role does the private rental sector play in easing the UK's housing woes? What are the biggest challenges facing the sector, and what is the Conservatives' vision that you can unite landlords and renters? And we're delighted to have 5 panellists joining us to debate these important questions. We have Rachel Maclean, who's MP and Minister for the Housing, MP for Redditch. Liam Halligan is Economics and Business Editor for GB News. We have David Simmonds, CBE MP, who is Chair of the APBG on Housing and Planning, and also MP for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner. We also have Zoe Grunewald, who is Policy and Politics Reporter at the New Statesman, and Ben Beadle, who is Chief Executive of the NRLA. So we've got about an hour to cover a hot topic, and I'll invite Rachel to open the discussion.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and it's lovely to be here. I think, if it's all right, can I start by asking a question with a show of hands? Can
Absolutely.
I ask how many people in this room are renters? Okay. How many people in this room are landlords? Have we got slightly more landlords than renters, do you think?
It's marginal.
It's
yeah.
marginal, okay. So that's quite helpful to know what we're addressing. And I think that highlights, if you like, the balance where we're trying to navigate between doing the right thing for renters and also enabling us to continue to do the right thing for renters by supporting landlords, good landlords. So we have to do both. So that your central question is, what can unite us and what do the Conservatives, what is the vision? We start from the position that we want everybody to have a safe and secure home in this country. Having somewhere to live, having a decent home to call your own is absolutely vital for us as a party. It's vital for young people. It's vital for everybody. Obviously, what we would really like is everybody to own their own home, but it's not realistic that everybody, especially when they're starting out in their career, are going to be in a position to own their own home. So we need to have a mix of tenures across the whole country. Yes, we need affordable housing, we need more council housing, more social housing, more self and custom build housing. I can see Richard Bacon here. If I don't mention that, he'll kill me later. And yes, we absolutely need to think about all of this. So what I would start by saying is the best way to tackle problems of affordability in the rented sector or in the ownership sector is just more supply overall. To paraphrase the young liberals, we need to build more bloody houses, right? We do need to do that across the board. And Michael Gover's talks a lot about that in his long-term plan for housing. How are we going to do that? We have to stick to our plans for the housing targets. We do still have them. We haven't dropped them. We need to accelerate growth and building in a lot of places, most especially in London, for exactly the reason that you've just said. London has got an absolutely woeful record of delivering the amount of houses that are needed for all sorts of reasons, but we as a government think it's absolutely right that we intervene because this is national infrastructure. And I think personally it's wrong that my constituents in Redditch, hard-working taxpayers who have saved up actually because it is more affordable for them, are having to subsidise people who, for whatever reason, need or want to live in London because it's so expensive there. So there's all sorts of things going wrong with this whole system across the board. So having said that, when it comes to renters and specifically the Renters Reform Bill, which is a piece of legislation we've introduced into Parliament, had its first reading, we are going to bring that forward for second reading and complete its passage soon, I hope. But it has been right that we've taken the time to speak to landlords while we do that, because landlords, including Ben Beadle in his capacity as excellent representative, but also not other landlords who Ben doesn't represent, individual people, people who just might have inherited a property, people who might have moved to a different part of the country, happen to have a property. There's really a lot of people in this sort of landlord bucket. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing by any means at all. And I'd like to say that out of the 4 million landlords, there are a lot of very, very good landlords who really care for their tenants, they look after them, they provide a service to society. And what we don't want to do is undermine their confidence in the market. We want to make sure that while we make these changes, which are, I believe, necessary and proportionate and right, we don't do it in a way that we feel that landlords are sort of losing confidence. So I just want to make it very clear that as a Conservative, I totally believe in the right of people to own property and to rent it out, as long as they are playing fair and playing by the rules. That is vital. If people are renting property out, they need to be able to get it back if they need to. They need to be able to evict bad tenants. So we have taken the time to work through how that would work in practice, because we have heard from a lot of people who are renting property that they are worried about, things going wrong and them not being able to get their property back. I'm sure I'm going to get an awful lot of questions on this, so I'm probably not going to spend all my time now. But I just wanted to set the scene. We're committed to this. I can see a lot of the people I've spoken to actually in this room who represent some of the renters groups, and I know how passionately they have lobbied, and they've done a brilliant job of bringing these issues to our attention. And what they've said to me time and time again, and it is true, one of the leading causes of homelessness in our country is no-fault evictions. And that, that is wrong. And I also say this before I shut up and go to your other panel. A lot of people have sort of said to me, Rachel, why are you doing this? It's not Conservative. No one, there's going to be nobody, no Conservative voters are going to vote for this. And I say to them, okay, I'm a grandma, by the way, I'm just going to get that out there. I've got 4 children, all of whom are in their late 20s and 30s. They're all professionals, they're all earning, they all vote Conservative. 3 of them live in the PRS in London, 1 lives in the PRS in Worcester. I'm afraid it's absolutely rubbish to say that these are not Conservative voters. That I'm not going to labour the point, but there are plenty of young people who are in the PRS who are not weed-smoking bad people, in gangs and, crap dens and everything else and smashing up the neighbourhood. There's lots of decent people, hard-working people in the PRS, and we need to do the right thing for them. So it is tricky. There's lots of things to get right, but I'll leave it there now.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for opening our conversation and framing the discussion there. You've commented on doing the right thing by renters without losing the confidence of landlords. There's a need for mix of tenures as well. So we'll move to Liam now, who is a commentator and author on the subject. Liam.
Thanks. I'm Liam Halligan. I'm the economics editor at GB News for my sins. No one likes us. We don't care. I've also wrote the economics agenda column in the Telegraph for 25 years now, every week. I started as a child. But I think the reason I'm here is because I wrote a book called Home Truths, paperback editions available at the conference bookstore. And Home Truths is about the UK's chronic housing shortage, how it happened, why it matters, and how to solve it. And let's be in no doubt, for today's young adults, they are spending more on their housing, whether they're servicing a mortgage or renting, and they're less likely to actually own their own home than any generation since the 1930s. 25 to 34-year-olds, when I bought my first property in the mid-90s, 60% of 25 to 34-year-olds owned their own home. Now it's less than 30%. If you look at the average age that a woman has her first child in this country, in 1991 it was 27, and in 1991 10% of 27-year-old women were in rented accommodation. It's now 28, and 48% of women at that age are in rented accommodation. In other words, this is seriously messing with our demography, the lack of home ownership and the overall shortage of homes. There's lots in my book about why there is a shortage of homes. It's partly the planning system, but it's not entirely the planning system, because there are over 1.4 million planning permissions outstanding that aren't being used. In London, work by Shelter has shown that 40% of planning permissions granted in London aren't used. In other words, they're taken up by big developers to stop small developers getting them and building them to generate contrived scarcity. All this stuff was conspiracy theory until about 3 or 4 years ago. The government now understands that what I'm saying is true. There's a CMA inquiry now into our house building sector, the first one since 2008, and not a moment too soon. So there is a chronic shortage of homes, and that of course spills over into the private rented sector, which is what PRS stands for, by the way. And that's expanded, as we heard from the opening comments, it's doubled over the last 2 decades, from about 10% of all households to 20% of all households. So young people have a hard time because they're paying high rents in lots of parts of the country, and even if they've got professional jobs, they can't get on the housing ladder in terms of ownership the way their parents could, and that really tears at the social fabric. So the UK housing market has gone from being a source of social mobility and fulfilment for many people, the British dream, to being a source of social immobility and rancor and upset. And a lot of young people are angry. They're angry because their parents are saying, why can't you buy a home the way I did? They're angry because idiots on television keep saying, well, interest rates were 15% in my day and we didn't eat avocado sandwiches. I mean, let's be completely honest here. Do the math. Young people are spending a higher proportion of their income on their housing, even at historically rather low interest rates, than my generation were at, post-ERM interest rates. It's just basic maths. So it's not because young people are feckless and go raving in Ibiza all the time. It's because in London they're often, average 40%, they're often paying 50 and 60% of their post-tax income on rent, which is madness. So we've got to understand that a lot of landlords, particularly, people with 1 or 2 properties, maybe because the stock market's been really ditzy post Lehman Brothers, they've invested in 1 property or 2 properties. A lot of landlords are at the receiving end of that anger, and the anger itself is caused by a shortage of homes, which successive governments of all parties haven't done anything to address, because the vested interests who want fewer homes are absolutely enormous, not least the house builders themselves. They build less, they're on higher margins, they make more money, and other existing homeowners who want the value of their homes preserved. So there's an awful lot of anger in this sector, and I'm concerned at the government's policies. I remain to be convinced that they are conservative, if you like. I think there's an awful lot of really good landlords out there who are penalised. The compliance that a lot of small landlords have to go through is labyrinthine. and I know that from my own experience. So in the end, we're only going to solve this problem if we build more homes, so that that rental costs come down, so they're a lower share of income, so people aren't freaking out all the time and pulling stunts on landlords, staying, sue us, or it'll take you 18 months in the small claims court. There's a lot of real bad practices going on among some private sector landlords, of course. But there are so many landlords who just have one or two properties who feel they're really being fleeced by a system that's being brought in to challenge, nasty HMO landlords, social sector landlords who are often rapacious, given that they're getting fat on what is now a £25 billion housing benefits bill. That's one thing, by the way. I wrote Home Truths as a love letter to home ownership because I lived in a first generation home ownership home. So my mum grew up in a council house, 10 kids. My dad grew up in a stone hut in the west of Ireland. So the fact that those two working class people could buy their own home revolutionised their life, their sense of themselves, and the values that they passed down to their children. But while I was writing Home Truths, it dawned on me just how important social housing is as well. The danger, Minister, is, and I've got a lot of respect for what you're doing. I know you've really worked hard to get across the brief, and I think in general you and the Secretary of State are doing a good job in very, very difficult circumstances. But the danger is there are a lot of social sector landlords who are completely out of order because their properties aren't monitored, they're often unsanitary, unsafe, seriously health risking. And I worry, and also in the private sector, of course, there are quite often institutional landlords who are guilty of bad practices. I worry that we're bringing in a sort of sledgehammer of measures designed to deal with those kind of big landlords, that smaller landlords, accidental landlords, ordinary people who, invite literally their tenants to, family gatherings and help their tenants in every way that they can, are getting, I use this term advisedly, monstered by legislation that's coming in that's completely against the spirit of who they are, what they're doing, and the way that they treat their tenants. And if that happens, and these people withdraw their services from the economy, the shortage of homes available for rent will become even more acute. Rents will go up, and we'll end up in a vicious spiral of nastiness that won't do anyone any good.
Liam, thank you for your reflections there. Some key themes there. So the maths of this, particularly from a tenant perspective, the impact on demography, clearly issues with the planning system, safety and conditions, and the benefits bill, and the anger side of it. A lot to cover there. David, you're in a London constituency and you're on the APPG of Housing and Planning. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alexandra. I think Liam's speech there was a really helpful introduction. I think what it illustrates for me is that when we talk about housing, we need to remember there aren't really solutions to the housing situation in the UK. There are trade-offs, which we're going to have to consider, and we'll have to make decisions as a government and as local authorities about what the best way forward is on that. So we know that the cost of housing relative to household incomes in the UK is about the highest it's been since the 1840s. It's been getting more and more unaffordable, and it took the best part of a century of a combination of state intervention, market intervention, charitable intervention in some cases, for housing to become more affordable before we started on the path we are facing now, where it's become more and more expensive. And of course, amongst those trade-offs, we do need to recognise that household pressures are not just about the cost of accommodation. We know that whilst the cost of accommodation has been rising, the cost of food, for example, as a proportion of household income, has been getting cheaper and cheaper. So almost the proportion have reversed since the 1950s, that people are now spending a lot less of household incomes on food, but a lot more on accommodation than was the case previously. So where does that leave us today, and what can I bring to this in terms of my experience chairing the APPG on housing and planning? Well, I think the key pitch from me is that we need to think differently about the planning process in this country. Now, I represent a constituency in 2 London boroughs, one of which I was a councillor in for 24 years, where I started out my political life as chairman of a planning committee. Both of those authorities have comfortably exceeded all of the housing targets that they've been given year after year from central government and from the London Mayor, in the context of a capital city that still falls well short of the aspirations that have been set out. And they've done that largely through an approach to regeneration of brownfield sites. But we're still running up against the problem that whilst, as Rachel says, we do need to build more homes, the practical constraints, especially in places on outer London where there is a lot of greenbelt land, create enormous barriers to that. And in my view, we need to think differently about supply of homes, not just about the numbers of units that we need to build. And we saw when we go back to the days of the idea that we'd have an algorithm which simply generate housing targets, that a local authority that had met a target of 1,800 will be told, well, next year your target's going to be 7,000. And if you could build 7,000, the next year it's going to be 20,000. It was obviously completely unrealistic that that was ever going to happen. But we are seeing a combination of developers and enlightened thinking by local authorities that looks at, for example, how we deliver new units of accommodation that are retirement housing and extra care housing that enables people who want to stay in the community they've lived in all their lives to stay there, but to downsize and free up a family home, often a family home on a large site that's sold to create 2 or 3 family homes. And all of this is beginning to help to generate that new supply of homes, to bring down the cost and to make that accommodation more affordable. And I fully recognise that this is a challenge that has enormous geographical disparities. My brother-in-law, who lives in Middlesbrough, is in a house that was a new build in 1995, and its current market value is pretty much what it was sold for when it was a new build in 1995. The equivalent home that was in my constituency is probably worth 5 times what its market value would have been at that period. And for developers who are bringing forward proposals, they need to recognise that that has enormous impact on profit margins. But to me, one of the things that's important about the Renters Reform Bill, but for us as a party that's important to talk about our relationship with the rental market, is the recognition that whilst home ownership is important, the rental market is incredibly important as well. There are lots of people in this country who, because they're students, because they're moving for work, because they are in a situation of transition in their life, a rental home is absolutely the way forward. And across many of our peer countries, particularly in Europe, renting throughout your life course, even as an affluent professional, is entirely the norm. It is what people do. And it's one of the reasons why many of those countries have a much newer, much more environmentally friendly housing stock, because the fact that those properties are not being owner-occupied means it's easier for those sites to be turned over, a more environmentally friendly stock to be developed. And when I think of the brilliant work that Richard's done about trying to encourage self-build, just how difficult that is in the UK housing market compared with the brilliant things that we see going on in other places, it seems to me that there must be some opportunities around there. And then I just wanted to finish on the point about how we finance a lot of this, because recognising that this rental market is going to be a really important part of supporting our economy, of supporting the housing needs and the political objective around the housing needs of the country. We have quite a number of players now in the market who are specifically interested in financing build to rent and moving away from the developer model which has been established for most of the market, that a developer will build at whatever pace suits them, will sell that home into the market and will simply move on to the next site. And when I was a planning chairman first time in 1998, one of the most contentious sites that I dealt with was a place called the Master Brewer next to Halligan Station. And after much wrangling, we granted consent for a development there. Well, 25 years later, no development has taken place. The site is derelict. It's been owned by 8 or 9 different developers, and each of those developers has come back for a higher density development. They've gained something from the local authority. They've then gone to the Mayor of London and gained a higher density. They've then gone to the Secretary of State or the planning inspector. Once they've achieved the most they can, they sell it on to somebody else. So actually, no homes have been delivered at all by a brownfield site that has enormous potential. And I think at the other end of the planning spectrum, we need to be thinking about what incentives we can have to ensure that when we consent that 1.4 million new homes, that they actually get built for the people that need them. That is probably 5 or 6 years housing supply based on the current build-out rate. So to be in a situation where that has already been consented and no progress is being made is clearly unacceptable, and we need to make sure there's proper accountability around the development industry for that.
Thank you very much, David, for your reflections there. You've picked up on, amongst other things, a few themes that haven't been touched on. So the retirement and extra care housing piece, self-build has been mentioned a couple of times. Clearly, there's a need for incentives to build out planning permissions, and you've commented on it sort of being trade-offs rather than, it's a trade-off in many ways. Right, moving over to Zoe for the political angle and maybe a reflection on from a younger person's perspective.
Everyone can hear me. Excellent. So I wanted to echo some of Liam's points. There is a huge housing crisis in this country. There is a shortage of affordable housing. This is why we're seeing so much pressure on mortgage holders, renters. It's one of the reasons why the only way that the Bank of England can help bring down inflation is by putting up interest rates. It's been an attractive investment property because there is a shortage of it. But on the other side of that, there are people with real life experience who are now worrying that they're going to lose their home. And that's across the private rental sector, that's across mortgage holders as well. So it's a really difficult situation. And if you lose your home, it's one of the worst things that could possibly happen to you. It plunges you into poverty, addiction, all those kind of issues are tied to insecurity with housing. So it's a real social problem. The private rental sector can be a good thing for the UK. It offers young people or people with jobs all around the country flexibility. You can move from one city to another in 2 months' time and you can get a new job, and that's fantastic. It gives young people an opportunity to live in all sorts of different places. It's good for our levelling up agenda, it's good for social mobility. But currently, the system has been very much tipped in favour of the landlords in terms of standards and regulation. On the one hand, if you have an issue with someone renting your property, you might lose a month's worth of rent. If you are served a Section 21 notice, you lose your home. So there is a difference there. There's a difference in the outcome. Having said that, the system can work, but it does need reform, and it's disappointing to see the Renters Reform Bill held up in Parliament. It's disappointing for young people who feel they're not being listened to when it comes to housing shortages in this country. For many, many young people, the idea of owning a home, it just seems totally impossible. And when you can't figure out how you're going to own a home, questions about how you're going to have a family, questions about how you're going to move on with your life, it's just held up, and that shouldn't be happening. The Conservatives are supposed to be a party of aspiration. They need to do more to inspire the younger generation. It's a political issue as well as a moral and ethical one. So we need reform. We need to see the Renters Reform Bill. We need to see an end to Section 21 notices. People shouldn't be being made homeless or worried about being made homeless because they're complaining about mould in their flat, for example. Now, I know there's a number of landlords in the room who are worried about their protections as well. This is why we need to have this conversation, and this sort of panel discussion is a great opportunity for it. Some people can put forward the perspective of the renter, someone can put forward the perspective of the landlord. It's about coming to a system which works for both parties, which means that people aren't made homeless at a moment's notice. It means that young people can think about their futures and plan for it. And it's just helpful for society to have a generation of young people who can get a foot on the property ladder. But ultimately, we do need to build new homes. That needs to be a political priority. We need to think about how we combat rising rental prices in this country that are pricing young people out of cities, pricing young people out of jobs. And we need to think about how we get that legislation through in a way where everybody's talking to each other.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Zoe. Reflecting there on the social problems connected with housing insecurity and also the impact of that on matters such as starting families. Ben, can you give us the landlord perspective from an England and Wales perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And I think the fact that we've got so many people in this room does just show that renting is such a key agenda item. And there's a lot within what has been said already that we can all share and get behind. But a couple of reflections from me. Firstly, all of these issues stem back to supply, I'm afraid. Whichever way you slice it or dice it, it is about the numbers. And it's right that we need to build more homes, but we also need to bring confidence to the people that are providing really decent homes at the moment. And the Minister rightly said that we need more supply and more confidence. I guess the slight difficulty we have is that it's one of those things that's quite difficult to picture, because when we look at some of the things that we're seeing in the sector, we're seeing rents at their highest on record. We're seeing landlord profits at their lowest since 2007. So I wouldn't want to give you the impression that rapacious landlords are absolutely creaming it in when it couldn't be further from the truth. We're seeing a huge amount of pressure. And that pressure has come, I should just say, we've got 1 million people on social housing waiting lists, and the PRS has done a fantastic job at picking up the social sector in a way and housing people. But in doing that, it's getting kicked left, right and centre. When we look at the cost base for landlords, and we look at things like mortgages, which have been exacerbated recently, these are all very deliberate decisions to cool the market. And these decisions around mortgage costs were taken in 2015 and now mean that landlords can't fully offset their mortgage interests. So when we have big hikes like we have seen, it's bad enough for the average homeowner, but if you are a landlord, add 20% on top. And that's why we're seeing some of these issues come to the fore. In terms of the backdrop, research by BVA said that 37% of landlords intend to reduce their portfolios and 67% have seen higher demand in the last year. Something has to give here, and this isn't actually about standards. We are very much wanting to look after our tenants. We have very high satisfaction, deal with repairs, deal with all of the things that we're expected to deal with. But at the end of the day, if we haven't got the right people, the right homes in the right places, then I'm struggling to see where people will actually live. And if we do want to be aspirational in terms of home ownership, we're not going to be if we don't have a private rented sector that can facilitate that.
Ben, thank you very much, and all our panellists for their reflections there. I'm conscious of the number of people in the room, so I'm going to go straight to the floor for the Q&A session, and I think we'll do 3 at a time. We have a roving mic, so if I could have the gentleman at the front here, and the lady in the pink on the right-hand side there to start us off. And if someone's got a roving mic... No sign of a roving mic. You're going to have to shout, I'm afraid. Please do say who you are and what organisation you represent.
So my name's Neil Cobbold and I'm from a company called PayProp. We work exclusively in the private rented sector. And I think as an industry we've been engaging with ministers and with Parliament.
Here we go. The microphone's arrived.
We've been engaging with ministers and Parliament, I think more than any bill I've been involved with previously. So that's been really welcomed. But I think there's some things that stand out, that for the industry, it's not the why. Almost everybody can see the why. And as Zoe said, the need to make sure that this works for renters and landlords combined is a real need. But there's some things that I think jump out to the industry, such as the removal of Section 21 and the open-ended tenancies has already been done in Scotland. And it was not the end of the sector, as people even then thought it was. But there were some things such as the housing court, which really helped to smooth that over and made sure that both residents and landlords were looked after. But we've said no to a housing court. And I think the worry is not the why. I think for the industry, it's the how. And without some of those things in place, that's what will be the unintended consequences of these that will ultimately mean that renters are the people who lose out. So I'd like to ask the panel why the decision, and probably more to the Minister, but other people's decision, not to go with the housing court option.
Okay, thank you very much. And then there's the lady on the right-hand side over here.
Hi, thanks. Really good panel. My name's Juliette Phillips. I'm a policy advisor at E3G, which is a climate change think tank. It's been talked about a lot that renters have been really hit by rising rents, but they've also really been hit by rising energy costs. And the Prime Minister recently pledged to never increase energy efficiency standards in any tenure, which obviously includes the private rented sector. And now I think there's quite a lot of concern that there's not really any policy incentive for landlords to increase standards, and there's been estimates this will increase renters' bills over the next decade by around £8 billion, so it's a lot of money. And I'll be keen to hear from Rachel and David in particular if the government's got any plans underway to increase energy efficiency in the private rented sector. Thank you.
That's great. And for ease, we'll go for the gentleman next to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Timothy Douglas from Property Mart. We're a professional body representing property agents. We're we've talked a lot about landlords and renters, but I think we also need to look at letting agents. The Secretary of State, Michael Gove, said in January that all property managers in the social rented sector should be qualified and currently are regulated. Surely we should be using the Renters Reform Bill to extend that to all letting agents, sales agents, and in a post-Grenfell world, managing agents as well. What does the panel think about that? Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Rachel, would you like to take those? At least two of them were directed your way, and then we'll
yes,
open
and
up.
I think these are all fair points. So on the courts, I think your first point is quite salient. So a lot of people have obviously rightly raised concerns with me that if we introduce these reforms, there will be a massive drop-off of landlords. And that would be bad for everybody, bad for renters and young people, and it would be bad for landlords. There's two things I'd say about that. The first thing is that if a landlord exits the market, that house still exists. So that house could be bought by somebody who's a first-time buyer. It could actually also be bought by another landlord. So the house is still going to be part of the system, and it's impossible to know what will happen to that house right now. That's the first point I would make. But I think your broader point about this has been done in Scotland, or some elements have been done in Scotland, because obviously we're not doing exactly what is going on in Scotland, because we don't agree with anything that the SNP government does, and we certainly wouldn't follow them as an example. But the key point that they haven't seen sort of this drop-off is, I think, quite a valid one, although I'd be careful about drawing too many inferences, which is why we're being quite cautious about it. But the housing court thing is quite interesting, because a lot of people have sort of lobbied me and said you need a housing court, and then we'll be happy with it. I don't think that's the answer. And why is that not the answer? Well, everybody, any criminal activity that happens, someone's going to come along and say this thing should be a priority for the criminal justice system. So you're going to have to take resources out of, I don't know, shoplifting or rape or fraud or something to deal with housing, and the judiciary are just going to say that's nuts, because ultimately we've got an independent judiciary. But what I do agree with you is that one of the major worries that landlords have, and this sort of goes to what Liam was saying, is that if I'm a really good landlord and I've just got a terrible tenant and I do actually need to get rid of them, I won't be able to do it. Now, we've spent a lot of time working very closely with landlords of all persuasions, accidental, deliberate, small, large, and we've thought about every single circumstance under the sun whereby a landlord might want to get their property back, and we've built that into the legislation. And Ben and others have been engaging with us for a very long time, and so have you and Property Mark and others. So we have thought about everything. There will be grounds for possession. But then the argument is, well, that's fine, you've done that, Minister, but this tenant, they won't listen to it, I'll have to go to the court. So what we know in the current system, actually, most landlords who come to me, they say, well, I'm a good landlord, I've never had to use Section 21, I might have to sell my property, and I've evicted them for that reason, etc. We actually know that only 1% of evictions actually end up in the courts anyway. It is a very small number, but nevertheless, I understand why it's a big worry for people. It's your house. You might need to get it back at short notice. You might want to move into it. You might need to sell it. You might be a buy-to-let landlord, and your costs might have gone through the roof. Loads of reasons why you might legitimately want to get your house back and not have to deal with a bad tenant and have all that conflict and aggro in your life. I mean, nobody wants that. So we do need to make sure that the criminal justice system is working. I spent a lot of time working with the MOJ, with Alex Chalk, with the others, just to look at, they are doing a whole load of stuff to sort of really sort out this system. The criminal justice system, the court system, has not been perfect. It's suffered a lot in the pandemic. There have been backlogs. Nevertheless, it is improving. They are making progress. They have put investment into it. It is improving. But I think it's very important that when we do introduce this legislation, we can say to landlords and give them a guarantee that if you do, in the small number of cases where you might unfortunately need to go to court to get your property back, where you've got a very bad tenant, you can get your property back, because we can guarantee that the court system will work for you. So we do need to see that improvement happening in the court system. So we are going to make sure and be very careful with the synchronisation of this legislation, so that when we do introduce it, we can give guarantees that the court system, the property tribunal, the property chambers, does work effectively. So I understand why people are calling for a housing court, but it isn't the answer, because we just have to take resources from somewhere else in the system and put them into a whole new housing court. We just need to get the whole system working properly.
Thank you, Rachel. David, did you want to reflect on those questions as well, perhaps picking up the energy standards one in particular?
Yeah, well, just briefly, I think Rachel's last point absolutely resonates with me. I'm not convinced that a housing court is the answer, but I do know as a constituency MP, I have, for example, military families returning to the UK where the tenants are refusing to vacate the family home, who are left stuck. I have constituents who have been 18 months without a rental payment in a property, who are at risk of losing their own home because the tenant is simply refusing to comply. And when there are backlogs in the court process, that then undermines the reputation of the whole system. And I think what's going on to try and streamline that is absolutely what needs to happen. On the energy cost point, I think to some extent the government was damned if it did and damned if it didn't on this, that the feedback certainly from a lot of representatives for the landlord market was that the increasing energy standards that properties were going to have to meet in order to meet, to be allowed to be rented out, was leading significant numbers of landlords to exit the market rather than undertake that capital expenditure. And therefore, the government had to make a trade-off. Would it be better for those homes to be available for people to rent, but acknowledging that the domestic energy cost would be higher? Or would it be better for those homes potentially to be lost to the market completely and people to be forced to look elsewhere? And I think that's a really difficult trade-off. But I think in the context of what Rishi Sunak was saying, I think he was right to highlight this is no longer an abstract debate about we're all committed to meeting a net zero target. This is about putting into legislation, enshrining in policy, what specific steps we are going to take to meet that. And given it's become pretty clear with what's going on in the rental market that this moment of crisis was approaching, a decision had to be made one way or the other. And I think the decision that's been made is the right one, because it preserves those properties in the rental market and then gives the scope for the energy improvement and efficiency works to be done, but over a longer period of time.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we haven't commented, I think, on the letting agent question. Liam, you mentioned safety and building and standards, building conditions. What would your thoughts be on having a regulated letting market?
Well, it depends how the regulation is implemented and if it's onerous red tape or if it actually improves the qualifications of the people involved. I mean, I'm sure it's very important to that particular subsector. With huge respect, I don't think it's the major issue at stake here. The major issue at stake is supply, as many people have said. I just wanted to say something about the Greenbelt because this is a Tory party conference after all. We couldn't possibly have a fringe meeting, let alone a dinner party, without mentioning the Greenbelt. So when I was researching Home Truths, I was absolutely shocked, and the numbers were very hard to come by, but they're all footnoted. I was shocked to learn that far from our green and pleasant land being concreted over, as endless CPRE people say and Lib Dems and so on, the Greenbelt, true story, when I last checked the numbers, now I know where they are, is 148% bigger now by acreage than it was in 1980. So it's more than doubled in size. And during that period, of course, we've added 20 odd million people. I'm all for a green and pleasant land. I'm all for areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks. And I'm all for green spaces that are genuinely accessible and of genuine aesthetic value. But the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, that vast swathes of our greenbelt, so-called, are urban scrub. They are farmland that's fallow. No one who's serious about solving our housing crisis in particular, including our rental crisis, once they understand it is largely a problem of supply, no one who's serious about addressing it can possibly ignore this mad policy that means more acreage is spent on golf courses in Surrey than on homes. The Greenbelt is now 13% of the landmass of this country. Residential property for both rent and ownership, including gardens, is 2%. True story.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious that I haven't been to Zoe and Ben yet, but I think we'll go back to the floor for more questions and invite them to comment from there. So, lady at the back, there in the corner.
Hi, thank you. My name's Laura. I'm a landlord. I'm also a property barrister by day job. My first one is having looked at the legislation in quite a lot of detail. With regards to Ground 1, I only rent out one property. It's a property in central London. My terms that the circumstances I'd want to have it back in the future would be my primary home is now in South Norfolk, but I'd like to use it for work. So effectively, it'd be a second home. Under the current legislation, I'm allowed to go back into it if it's not my primary residency. Under this newly proposed legislation, it would have to be my primary residency. So I'd have to leave South Norfolk, despite having a job that's London-based 3 days of a week. So it's effectively a worse deal from that perspective. Though it is obviously a widening out the definition of a family to grandchildren, but it wouldn't cover a situation where, for example, I'd like to let it out to my nephew, for example. So that's not within Ground 1. So it's having that possibility for a second home for work, for example. My second issue, which is kind of from my personal experience of doing lots of possession hearings as part of my day job, is probably the definition of intentionally homeless is quite vague. So I'm often doing possession hearings, Section 8, Section 21, and the situation outside court is that the tenants are very happy to leave. They've noticed that they can't ever pay their rent. However, their advice that they received was that they wouldn't be considered homeless by the council unless they went and they actually objected to the order being made against them. So it wasn't a situation where, say, after 2 months expiring and they left, then they'd potentially be considered homeless and be given council accommodation. So they've then had to issue proceedings, have that cost against them, and a fee for the day. So it's very expensive. But anyway, that's my, so there's unintended consequences.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to the gentleman next to you.
Thank you. My name is Ben Toomey. I'm the Chief Executive of Generation Rent, with a voice for private tenants across the UK. Just a quick one on the idea of landlords leaving the market because of particularly Section 21 being removed. I'm really pleased that Ben Beadle and then NRLA support the removal of Section 21, as does Generation Rent. There's unity between good landlords and good tenants on this topic. But what I would ask is, if there are some landlords that are threatening to leave the market when there's something that they don't like about the market, how does that show the so-called balance between landlords and tenants when private tenants have no choices? They can't go into social housing, there's not enough to meet the need. They can't just choose to buy their own home because of the soaring rents that means no one can save. Landlords have that threat to make to government, but there's a power imbalance because tenants can't do anything about being in the private rented sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll have one more at the front here, the lady in the green.
My reward for standing. Thank you. I'm Morgan Vine. I work for the National Older People's Charity Independent Age, and we specifically support older people on low income. So it's been a really constructive discussion, and it's been fantastic to hear about younger renters. Just want to fly the flag that there are older renters as well. That number is growing absolutely massively. It's the largest group of renters that are going to, and obviously it's going to get worse because we're going to have people with no savings and not owning a property, passing their state pension age and needing support. So definitely supportive of younger renters, but just flying the flag for older renters. So one specific thing with the renters reform proposals, at the moment landlords can reject people if they are in receipt of social security payments, and the government has done a great job promoting pension credit, for example, and then anyone receiving pension credit, that's basically for people on a low state pension, and it might be because they took time out to care for friends or family during their life. It's normally women. If they receive pension credit, they can just, for no other reason, be denied a rental property. So I just wanted to ask whether the Minister was thinking about things like banning no DSS discrimination. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We will go to Zoe. Would you be willing to comment perhaps on that balance of the tenant and the landlord and the fact that tenants don't have an option?
Yep. So I agree. I think, unfortunately, the balance is very much tipped in favour of landlords. As I said before, if you're a landlord and you have a difficult tenant, you may well lose money, and that is very difficult. I know a lot of landlords only have one property and it might be a source of income for them. But on the other hand, for tenants, they can lose their home. They can be on the streets. As we know, there's a huge shortage of rental properties in the UK. So if you are served a Section 21, then trying to find another rental property as prices are going up every day within your budget that might be suitable for you and your family. If you have a pet, we know loads of properties don't accept renters with pets. There's all sorts of issues there. So absolutely, the balance is skewed, and this is why we need the Renters Reform Bill urgently, I would say, to come through to help protect tenants in that case. I also take the point, of course, there are older renters, and we often, I was doing earlier talking for younger renters, but of course there are older renters who need protections too. And again, it's been at the discretion of landlords whether or not they will accept renters in receipt of social security payments. And as pointed out, that you have no option. If you are in the private rented sector, you have to stay there. You can't just buy a house. It's out of your control. So we do need to make it much fairer. We need to make the options much bigger for renters, and we need to make the pool bigger as well. And that goes back to building more houses. Ultimately, we do need to build more houses, but in the meantime, we need to protect renters, and we need to make sure that people aren't homeless, they aren't spending way beyond their means. And one of the reasons we talk about young people a lot is because, unfortunately, it is hampering their futures. But we do need to think about older renters too, absolutely.
I can tell Liam would like to respond to that.
Just very briefly, just to say I agree with a lot of what Zoe said, and well done you for saying it. I wrote the book that I wrote because for my kids' generation, because they've got a much worse deal than my generation had. Just on speed of building homes, everyone thinks this is going to take ages, right? Building homes is basically Victorian technology, right? I'm come from a long line of Irish builders, right? It's not difficult once you get the land. The problem is getting the land and all the bullshit that goes with it. But actually, lashing homes up, even good quality homes, does not need to take a long time, even if they're conventionally built. And I too pay homage to Richard Bacon's work on modular housing. This can really happen quickly. It's all about the land. And I've been talking to ministers at senior level about things they can do quickly. And one thing they can do really quickly, even if they don't have a massive row about the Greenbelt, the state owns 6% of all freehold land in this country. In urban areas, the state owns 15% of all freehold land. Much of that land is ripe for development, but Treasury dogma means that they won't sell that land because they always think they can get a better price in a year's time or 2 years' time. If a lot of that state land was requisitioned and made available for small builders in particular who build quickly to build decent both social homes, to the lady's point about we've got absolute pandemic of older people hitting after work, they aren't homeowners, and this is only going to get worse when all the 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds who aren't now homeowners get to retirement age. We're going to need an awful lot of social housing in this country. Now, I talk as a broadly sort of free market person, right? We're going to need an awful lot of social housing in this country. We're going to need an awful lot of housing made available for rent. It's all about supply, which in turn is all about the land. If the state used just 1% of its land, right, that's enough to build 1 million homes at average density of 45 homes per hectare, a density which obviously can be much, much higher in urban areas. We absolutely have to grab this problem by the scruff of the neck. It's going to take quite radical reform, because unless we actually deal with this, not just extremely smart young people who are angry at the system, but right the way up, people that can't have families because they can't actually get hold of a home. It's absolutely heartbreaking. Don't be surprised when our politics gets really radical, right? Don't be surprised. Why did Lloyd George do Homes Fit for Heroes? I read the cabinet minutes. Because they saw what was happening in Russia with the revolution. I'm serious. Unless we deal with this problem, then our politics is going to go in a really nasty direction. And I don't apologise if I sound alarmist.
Thank you. Ben, your reflections on these themes.
Well, just to deal with those particular points in the last couple of minutes that we've got, it does all come back to supply, and it does all come back to confidence. The intentionally homeless point is a damning indictment of the supply crisis, where local authorities tell a tenant to stay put despite having received a valid notice, and then the court system encourages that by not processing a valid claim for 6 to 12 months. That's a massive problem. The other thing I was just going to add, love your question, Ben. My job is to be the pragmatist for the private rented sector and for landlords, and I think the best way that we can make Section 21 abolition work is a viable alternative to it, and that's why I'm really pleased to see so many legitimate grounds set out, but the piece that's missing from the equation is what court reform looks like, and I'm very pleased to hear the guarantee from the Minister today. As far as older renters are concerned, I'm afraid we're all getting old, but the problem is the number of homes that are available to people. If we have 20 or so queuing around the block for each home that's there, then those people with particular needs and things that need to be done, like adaptations to the property, may well not get a look in, and that is a problem. And that's why I say, if we want to make sure we've got the right sort of homes, we do need the confidence to go with it. And the Minister says if a property does get sold, it doesn't necessarily disappear. I get that, but if it leaves the private rented sector, that's one less home for the private rented sector that doesn't get replaced, and that makes everything much more expensive. And back to Liam's point, I feel that anger out here. You know, I feel the anger between landlords and tenants through no fault of their own, and it's really time that we take a step back and make some sensible long-term decisions for a sector that works for everybody.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the end. I'm conscious that Rachel has to go at 5 o'clock on the dot, so can I have your final reflections before you depart, and we'll ask the same for David.
Oh,
to round
well,
off.
thank you. I think it's been a brilliant discussion, and what I've really enjoyed about it is we've got landlords and tenants in the same room. I think when I do hear what Liam says, there is a lot of anger out there. I think that the issue of public sector land disposals is something that I'm looking at very carefully.
You don't have to dispose it, you can lease it.
Yeah, I know that. But if you are a hospital and you've got a spare car park, by the way, they don't have spare car parks because they all need more car parks. It's often a lot more complicated than it seems, as you will understand. Because actually, what all those departments need is they've got reasons. They want to, possibly build a new. I mean, I've got this in my own patch. They might want to build a new operating theatre, or there might be another use for it, and they can sell it or lease it, and they can get money for their own services. Because ultimately, you're really talking about public money, taxpayers' money. So it's it can look like dogma, but it's also sensible stewardship of public money.
There's also the housing benefits bill, of course, on the other side.
And there's the housing benefit. All of these things. So that's why I say, look, there's tensions on all sides. I think it was David that said there's no kind of simple solution whereby everybody will get everything that they want. There's always trade-offs. But it's my job as a minister to think, not just to think about one sector or the other, or a landlord or a tenant or a homeowner or young or old. I have to think about all of this, right? So I have to listen to all of this and figure out how we can not only try and meet you, not halfway, but maybe a bit more, like 3/4 of the way, so that you actually, you're going to write to your representatives and they're going to vote for this legislation in Parliament. I ultimately believe it is the right legislation. We do need to bring it forward and do it in a pragmatic way. But also we can go to the electorate and say, we understand. We understand that you feel disenfranchised. You haven't got the capital. You can't buy a house. We need to help you. And I think Liam said earlier, it's just so annoying when people my age start lecturing young people.
Oh, yeah.
And believe those of us who've got kids that age, don't do it, because we get a flea in our ear and more than that, and a bucket of water poured over our heads, because they remind us regularly that we are not only out of touch but like put out to pasture. So we have to totally listen to you and others, Generation Rent, Priced Out, all of these people, and try and do our best to balance all of this and get it right.
Thank you very much. And David, one last word.
Yeah, a very final, very brief word. I think it's been a really good discussion. I think we could probably spend the rest of the evening here debating some of the ins and outs of the housing market.
I'm going to go and do it again next door.
No, we'd end up fighting.
Just two final points I was going to make. One was around the fact that this is a long-term issue. So we talk a lot about availability of social housing. A lot of the housing stock, 12,500 homes in one of my local authorities, is based on lifetime inheritable tenancies, because they were the norm in the social housing sector until very, very recently. So we have a huge block of social housing, in many cases people who once qualified to pay £70 a week for a home that today would rent at £500 a week at affordable rent, who are in that, and their children will inherit the right to live in that until they die as well. So we have to be thinking about some of these things in a long-term way. And on the planning side, I mean, I think I take very much the point that Liam made about the releasing of land. I think we also need to bear in mind one of the reasons there's been a growth in the Greenbelt is because a lot of the conditions to allow development were that additional land nearby would be placed in the Greenbelt to compensate for the loss of green land to new housing. So we've seen, particularly around some of the new towns and the developments around London, that's the deal. The farmer is told, yeah, you can build 100 houses on that field as long as the field next door goes in the Greenbelt to guarantee it will never be built on.
The Greenbelt will stay the same size.
So we need to, I think we need to recognise...
It's more than doubled in size.
I think we need to recognise that those kind of trade-offs are a part of the system, and people treasure and value their green spaces. They're important for health, and they are something that requires consideration as we look at housing development.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's been an animated discussion right the way to the end. That brings us to the end of this panel. If you'd like to know more about Bright Blue, please speak to the team or look online for membership. Our next event is on boosting labour market participation in this room at 6 o'clock. And with that, a big thanks to our panel, to our supporter NRLA, and to our audience. Thank you very much.